think that what is a sacred site is something which is constructed by people, which is why we have so many different sorts of what is sacredness. But for some of those people, that sacredness can be inherent in the place itself. So that might be called the genius loci.
It has a certain attraction. I'm kind of pulled here by something beyond my intellect, really.
It's old, it's got to have some mysterious. We can't work out exactly why it's there. There's lots of theories. So there's got to be something there.
It's very, very old. People have been coming here for thousands of years. People believe that it's sacred and therefore it becomes sacred.
Stonehenge is much more than the stones that we see that I think most people tend to focus on or think about. Stonehenge is part of a landscape, and in prehistory it would have been quite a large landscape. There are the stones themselves, there's the avenue that leads up to the stones, there is the Cursus monument, the newer King's Barrows behind me, around a mile or so behind me also Durrington Walls and Woodhenge, and scattered across this landscape are a number of Bronze Age round barrows. And all of this in various stages in prehistory would have made this a very significant landscape. Stonehenge is many things to many people, and I think it has a very long and complex history, and it's meant a lot of things in that history.
I love Stonehenge for many reasons, and one of the reasons I love it is it's a centre, it's a place where our national conversation, cultural conversation is being processed, where all the cultures are coming together, melting down, organising around a certain spirit.
It's a gathering of people who want to see something unique happen once a year, and it's just a nice atmosphere, and whether you're religious or not, anybody's welcome. So, in that sense, the freedom of coming here is sacred.
To just look at everyone around me, see everyone else enjoying it, listen to good music, look at interesting clothes, see people of all ages, meet new people. Yeah.
There are a number of ways in which the competing understandings of sacredness in sacred sites do conflict. One would be in terms of interpretation, so that heritage-aligned literature is something we see more often than alternative interpretations of sites. Another form would be in terms of physical access to sites, Stonehenge being a classic example in that people can only visit there at certain times of day. There is a rope cordoning off the stones, so it's not possible to enter that site, and only during managed open access at various points of the year, particularly summer solstice, is it possible to get inside the stones. That's the way Stonehenge is presented to us, and that's the way Heritage has decided to do that at the current time. But for other visitors, their understanding of sacredness would require another way of performing Stonehenge, a more tactile engagement, visiting the stones directly, touching them, listening to them, singing to them, and that sort of engagement is rarely offered. It's a honeypot site, it's a site that inevitably is focused on. It's been called an icon of Britishness, the most famous archaeological monument in the world, etc. Stonehenge is the classic, and the Battle of the Beanfield is the classic example of what can happen when things go wrong. The Battle of the Beanfield in 1985 was at the end of the Stonehenge Festival, when the peace convoy, as it was called, was forced into a beanfield near Stonehenge, and there was a certain amount of police brutality against new travellers who were on their way to Stonehenge to the festival. It's a good example of how conflict can happen at sacred sites and how all of the people interested in these places become embroiled in that conflict. Today at solstice is unusual in the diversity of people that are attracted to the site, and year by year it's clear that there is a very varied number of people that have interest in Stonehenge, from most obviously the pagans, druids, witches and others who will come dressed in order to perform their own Stonehenge in a particular way, to other interest groups, tourists who might just turn up and not realise that it's solstice and have a rather different experience than they would during the daytime, to local people who come in from Amesbury, Salisbury. This year in particular there was a rather large number of what seemed to be a post-GCSE school crowd celebrating the end of their exams. This year in 2007 there was a day in between the solstice and Glastonbury, and it's traditionally been a stopping off point for those in the alternative community who do the festival circuit.
By the great lords of water! By the great lords of water! Not I nor thee before the trees! Not I nor thee before the trees! Not I nor thee! Not I nor thee! But the great lords of earth! But the great lords of earth! So be it! So be it!
I love Avebury. I came here 4 years ago and moved down here straight away. It was like I'd come home, left London and moved down here. And it just seems to me to be very magical.
When I first started coming down here, I went to places and I was just almost remembering things rather than learning things. You walk somewhere, you go to a stone or you do a certain ceremony, and it just comes out of your heart. Now, whether that's coming from me or whether it's coming from my ancestors, I don't know. I believe that we come back from our ancestors, and I believe that they have an influence. For me, I feel a strong connection to the people that built this place.
There's a whole diverse range of people who come to Avebury. From an archaeological point of view, we have archaeologists and researchers coming here, and education groups. But of course, Avebury has a village within it, a living farming community.
It definitely has the balance between the male and the female aspects here, which a lot of sacred sites in England don't have. The energy here is also very orientated around families, and people that come here come for serious worship rather than partying mode.
Avebury is really a place that's set aside from the everyday of life, as far as we can tell from the artefactual evidence. That is to say that compared to other sites from the later Neolithic, for instance, the few occupation and settlement sites that we have, the material from Avebury is really very little. There are very few finds, very few sherds of pottery, a few human remains that probably date to the rather later use of the site, really, into the early Bronze Age period, beaker remains. But what we don't find is evidence of midden or rubbish deposits, for instance. So that it's the sort of thing that you can tell you have, if you like, a site that's kept clear. If you think, for instance, of great medieval cathedrals or churches, then they're the sort of places that you would expect to be maintained and for much of the time kept clean and respected. And that's the sort of thing, really, that we're seeing a parallel with it at Avebury during the Neolithic. I think there is certainly some suggestions from the way in which Avebury is created, the architecture, if you like, that there are certain devices, for instance, like the great henge bank, the internal ditches. The important thing is that the ditches are internal, so you're looking at an enclosing space rather than something that is excluding people, so you're not looking at something that's defensive. You're enclosing spiritual acts or possibly spirits, ancestors, gods. You're keeping the sacred in one particular place. Then you have a whole series of what might be described as focusing devices. 2 internal stone circles a southern and a northern ring of stones, which originally contained two further settings of monuments, the Cove and a small D-shaped setting of stones, only parts of which remain today. You're looking at people who put a great deal of effort into expressing their spiritual beliefs. So the one thing it can absolutely tell us is that people really valued ceremonial and spiritual life as being a core part of what was important to them.
It's important to see Avebury as a village which has a very long history, not just in its prehistoric times, but in the last 100 years. There was the re-erection of many of the stones by Alexander Keeler. Most of the stones that we see today were not standing until very recently. The village itself, some of the cottages were demolished during Keeler's time in order to give more of a feel of a prehistoric landscape. So the Avebury we see today is itself almost a particular photo frozen in time, and no doubt Avebury will change more in the future.
This is the major temple of Great Britain. It's connected with a lot of other sacred sites, and it's part of a 7.5 mile circle of sites, which was a major religious place in the past and still is a major place of energy. Here we all work, or try to work together, that we have people from all different paths. When we conduct our ceremonies, it doesn't matter whether you're a solo practitioner or whether you're a druid or a Wiccan or a northern tradition or a chaos magician or whatever you are, you're welcome to come and join in our circle. I've got a little saying, we stand among the sacred stone, every one of us is different, not one of us stands alone.
It's quite interesting down here in terms of the conflict that arises out of the sacredness of the site. There's definitely been a shift over the last 5 years between the pagan community, or the people that come here, and the non-pagan villagers. 5 years ago they absolutely hated the sight of us, couldn't understand why we did what we did and thought we were all devil worshippers. Through the work that the pagans in the village have done and the regulars setting up the Avebury Guardians, really those barriers have begun to disintegrate and much more began to work together. So for example, the National Trust now trains all of their employees on the festivals and why we do what we do.
Wherever you have a range of different groups of people with different interests, then you're going to have a certain amount of tension. But that doesn't necessarily mean to say that has to result in conflict. Clearly there will be a different interpretation put on Avebury, for instance, from archaeologists than some of the pagan groups who come here. And likewise, the villagers have different needs to particular pagan groups or even day visitors. There are occasions when people leave offerings on the site. There are occasions when people will light candles and leave them on the stones. What it means is that potentially things like candles and tea lights can do damage to the stones. They can crack them, particularly in cold weather. And if the wrong sort of offerings are left, not only is there a build-up of materials over time, which can be a health hazard, but also they can actually be poisonous to sheep, for instance, so it can prevent grazing of the monument. So one of the things that's been done here is that some of the pagan representatives from the Sacred Sites Forum that we have here on the site got together with myself and one of the individual pagans who've been working at the site on conservation for a long time, and together we wrote a set of visitor guidelines. The
National Trust have worked with us and we work with them, and we now have a guardian scheme, and they encourage us to use the site for our ceremonies because they believe this was a major ceremonial site and it's an appropriate use.
One thing most recently which has come into the frame regarding sacred sites and sacredness and conflict is that of reburial of human remains.
The purpose of the gathering today is to bring to the public's attention the fact that a 3-year-old child skeleton, locally known as Charlie, is on display in the museum. We think that's unethical.
The reburial issue has been very much on the agenda in archaeology and anthropology on the world stage, and has only recently come to Britain in the pagan community. Pagans have been drawing on the views, the discourse of indigenous peoples in terms of reburial, thinking about their connection to ancestors in sacred places like Avebury and Stonehenge and elsewhere, and thinking about ancestor welfare as much as they are site welfare. So where are the human remains that once were left here, buried here? They're now in museum collections, in university collections, and pagans are concerned about that. Some are calling in an extreme way for immediate reburial of these remains in the places they once came from.
These people were buried by their own tradition in their own places, and I feel it's very dishonouring to go and dig up bones and disturb the burial places.
Many of those places may well not exist anymore. They might be covered by roads, they might be covered by housing developments, or at somewhere like Avebury it's very difficult because the reburial of those remains may attract tomb robbers. So it's a complicated issue, and it's something which has emerged quite recently, and heritage managers are having to come to grips with this.
I don't believe the people whose bodies it were are attached to the bones in any way. There's no sense of unrest when I go up to the burial mounds or to the long barrow, so I don't think the spirits have been disturbed. Also, there's the question of what would we do with them? Where would we put them? You know, what sort of ritual would we do? Because one of the things that's really important to me is that we would have to honour the ways of the ancestors in which they were buried. Well, here in England, we don't have that level of information. We can make a good guess, but we don't really know. It would be great to get to a place where we have an agreement that no more burial mounds, no more long barrows are excavated and the bones are put into museums. Let's let them be and return to the land in which it was intended, rather than just having them on display for us to ogle at.
One of the reasons I was drawn to collaborate as an archaeologist, an academic archaeologist on the Sacred Sites project, is that I'm a pagan myself. Avebury is a stunning place archaeologically, and as an archaeologist that's one reason I'm drawn to this place, and it's difficult for me to separate the archaeologist in me from the pagan in me. They're just a part of me, and I'm drawn to this place archaeologically, but I'm drawn to it more than that as well. It is a place of ancestral wisdom. It's a place that I can come to, meditate in, perform ritual either alone or with companions, and that in itself is empowering. So Avebury, I think, for many pagans is an empowering place. It re-enchants our lives, so in a time of modernity, in a time of industry, in a time of world conflict,